Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in our session, Social Connections in a Virtual World. My name is Jonathan Stringfield. I oversee global business marketing, measurement research, and insights at Activision Blizzard across our media and esports disciplines. So I oversee a team that essentially goes out to the market, talks to marketers about the power of gaming and the people that are involved in the gaming universe, using science to substantiate the unique value from these platforms. To that end, what we found is that over the past couple of years, one of the most common questions we would receive is realistically about how has the pandemic impacted gaming and overall media consumption behaviors during that time. So we know through a lot of the takes that have been out in popular media that indeed gaming has increased, but why has gaming increased and what are some of the motivations there? And then perhaps getting to the golden question as we start to think about the potential end of a pandemic, will these behaviors continue on? So to address these, we decided to put together some unique and innovative research to really kind of start to plug into what are the media consumption behaviors and patterns of folks, particularly during this period when physicality wasn't possible. So to that end, we conducted multimodal research with partners from M4 Mobile Research. And essentially, this was taking the form of a media diary. So over the period of about 7 days, we followed around a set of consumers and had them log essentially where, when, and how they were consuming media, how that kind of fit into their overall lifestyle, and also started to pick up some things such as sentiment about how they felt about the platforms that they were consuming or otherwise via some pre and post surveys throughout the period. We additionally supplemented that with some qualitative focus groups to, again, get a little bit more of that rich layer in terms of how media was kind of fitting into their lives and realistically how it may or may not have shifted in a period which, again, overall our consumption behaviors, particularly around media, have been a little bit differentiated by merit of needing to stay at home or realistically having less capability to reach out to others, given that, again, the study period was from November, December of 2020 when things were still pretty much more or less in lockdown. So from this particular research, we have what I think is a very rich data set that speaks to a number of factors across how media behaviors may have shifted throughout this period. So today what we want to do is talk about 3 of these findings. So the first is, again, to the point of the study, what was the impact of 2020 and the pandemic on individuals' media consumption, how these things change, or how did media kind of fit into their lifestyles? We'll then go into, again, to the extent to which that we can talk about it, how will this shift when things get back to normal, right? So if we're to believe that there was some degree of shift in terms of media behaviors during the pandemic, was there or are there some of these behaviors that will carry when we're perhaps no longer as restricted to stay at home? And then finally, and I think important to folks watching here, what does this mean for brands and how are brands really kind of meeting this moment where, realistically individuals' lifestyles have never been more challenged. And if anything, there is a heightened expectation of how media can start to fit into the lives of consumers. So starting with our first question in terms of what was 2020's impact on media consumption, it'll surprise absolutely no one that, I think probably one of the more obvious findings that we got out of the study is that indeed, almost universally, 91% of consumers reported that overall their consumption of digital entertainment increased. So again, aside from that being fairly intuitive, perhaps from your own experience, but then also from the accounts that we've heard across popular media, it kind of makes sense in a world where, again, if we're more or less going to be restricted at home, we're looking for new ways in which that we can kind of start to consume media. And even if before the pandemic, the whole concept of things like reducing screen time or digital detox or otherwise were starting to become things that folks were becoming a little bit more critical of, I think it's fair to say that there was a certain degree of relaxed expectations around that as the consequences or the conditions of the pandemic continued that, ultimately we were just looking for more entertainment, more ways to entertain ourselves, more ways to kind of distract from or find ways through which that we could be at home and still keep ourselves entertained. And it might not be surprising then that for the most part, a lot of this consumption happened to be as solo behaviors, or in other words, that again, in a world where physicality was quite difficult, a lot of this media consumption was happening on an individual basis. However, that did provide a lot of opportunities, more specifically for any type of media that did have more social opportunities, those tended to be things that folks really wanted to invest in and that were kind of privileged in terms of their overall consumption patterns during this period. So when we think about, some of the motivations that individuals had in terms of, where, when, and how they're plugging into their entertainment choices, realistically, we found is that social connection was a strong motivator. And gaming in particular has always been a social activity. If you think back to the days of arcades, to sitting on a couch with a console, it's one of these types of entertainment forms that really kind of starts to privilege or is really based around having mechanisms through which that we can interact with each other. Now, in a world where physicality is that much more difficult, we found that there were other mechanisms through which people could still tap into it. And indeed, there are games like Animal Crossing or perhaps worlds like Fortnite or Roblox where individuals were kind of using them as social platforms and not just gaming platforms. But then also there were instances where, folks would join a happy hour at their company or with friends and family to play things like Jackbox or Among Us or other highly social games that really kind of fit into the conditions of, where we were and how we were consuming media. So again, long and short is that, when we look at the quantitative results, they said, one of the strongest motivators, in fact, 40% of individuals when they were reporting their motivations for playing games really came from the social aspects of it. And much of that due to the fact that it's one of the superpowers of gaming that, particularly in a more internet-enabled world, it allows us to be connected and to enjoy activities together, even in a world where physicality is difficult. And then moreover, when you think about parents who arguably were probably more hard hit by the conditions of the pandemic, by merit of homeschooling, need to make sure that, the needs of their children were catered to, there too, there was a lot of opportunities that gaming could fulfill for them insofar that it gave kind of common ground for them to either enjoy a game with their child or realistically have some other activity that they could also work with their children in that, in a world where overall entertainment options were a little bit more limited. So when we think about then, when we go back to normal, is this something that's going to be kind of durable and something that will continue to be part of our media landscape? So as per usual, even now, I do think we have to have that level set that, when exactly normal is still a little unknown at this point. Again, certainly at the point of when this research and the data was being collected, we were certainly still within, kind of one of the higher watermarks of the pandemic. It's still the case that, while there's restrictions are easing, there's still a little bit of difficulty in terms of, folks getting back to the pre-pandemic normal in terms of behavioral patterns or travel or what have you. So fair to say there is a little bit of a question that, are these things changing? Do we have reason to believe, or do we have data that could start to, point to where this can go? And I think there's a couple level sets or a couple things that we can look at that start to paint a little bit of a picture of where this may be heading. So the first is when we think about media consumption during the pandemic, there were a number of potential avenues or potential vectors for media that really kind of popped. And I think that, really kind of captured the imagination of the media. And I think gaming was certainly one of them, as we talked about before, but also streaming. But if we look at how some of the data describes how individuals were interacting with these ecosystem, it wasn't necessarily the case that this was, new entertainment that they're investing in, or they were kind of, trying things they had never tried before. In fact, what we found is, in addition to things that may be a little bit more obvious, like music or social media, 3/4 of the individuals that said that they were participating in streaming or gaming had done so before. So it was less that, folks were suddenly spontaneously starting to game, so much as they were going back and revisiting this as something that they had, perhaps done maybe in the recent past or further back. So I think one of those first misconceptions, which I think is important as it pertains to what's the potential future trajectory of where this could go, is that it's not just that individuals kind of found themselves gaming with no prior experience. In fact, many of these folks had gamed in the past. And there's also something to be said about the relative parity if we look at streaming and gaming that, again, when we think about the overall media reaction, there was a lot of PR buzz around the two, with more of it being a little incredulous around gaming rather than streaming. Or in other words, it seemed kind of odd in a lot of the press pieces that it's like, oh, all of a sudden people are gaming, but the same lens wasn't applied to streaming. And again, this research starts to kind of point to, maybe that shouldn't have been the case, or maybe we shouldn't have been surprised. And one thing that we'll talk about momentarily is that some of that has to do with the fact that, aside from the high parity in terms of individuals that were essentially returning to this behavior, a lot of the core motivations that go behind the consumption of these entertainment forms is very similar. Again, something that we'll talk about momentarily. So again, this is, I think, indicative of, where are things as they sit now? Where are things going to go in the future? And again, we're going to stop short in terms of making, complete bold claims in terms of, what this, portends for the future. But again, I think there's a couple other data points that we can think about that starts to paint a little bit clearer of a picture. One of which being that, again, we simply asked folks, how do they foresee that this will continue to be involved in their media ecosystem moving forward? And again, quite a few folks who noted that they had been gaming in the or during the pandemic, in fact, 73%, said that, they state they plan to play games the same amount or more moving forward. So again, on the one hand, we can look at this and take it at face value, and it seems like, okay, a lot of folks are going to carry this forward. The other that I think is important to recognize is that, again, for the most part, human behaviors change pretty slow. Technology patterns tend to change pretty quickly. Over the course of a pandemic, we do have a fairly rich amount of time through which that, again, it's coming from or stepping away from just being something that happened over a couple of weeks or months, but realistically something that's been happening for upwards of a year. So the extent to which the gaming has been that much more integrated into individuals' media diets during this time, it's something that is now perhaps more kind of encapsulating their behaviors moving forward, and something that's just kind of now kind of a part of how they continue to entertain themselves, again, through digital media. There's also something to be said that in tandem with the environment of the pandemic, it's been the case that for the most part, games in general have become much more accessible via, consoles and games as a service and things like mobile phones. But then also the design of these games is getting to the point where they're realistically really trying to open up to virtually everyone. So you look at the design, the technology factors on top of the behavioral patterns that are coming from the pandemic. And what you're seeing is that we're really kind of getting into an environment where indeed folks are going to be primed to kind of carry some of these pastimes forward. So again, we'll obviously continue to track this as we move forward. It's obviously an area where we'll be continuing to research as a function of time. But as it stands now, if the overall question is, again, is this an anomaly? Is it just the case that folks were simply simply playing games by merit of the fact that they were at home and bored as part of the pandemic? There's reason to believe that there's a little bit more that might be propelling folks to kind of invest in gaming in the future. So that said, when we think about, okay, the overall media ecosystem here, inclusive of gaming, what's the opportunity for brands and how are they meeting the moment here? So as noted before, what we did do throughout this research is ask not just about the consumption patterns, but also some of the background behaviors, some of the background benefits that they would get from it. And again, when we look at the case of gaming, it's pretty straightforward of kind of what you'd expect in terms of what the actual benefits were, things like providing connection. Again, we talked a bit about how social connectivity was very important to folks, keeping calm, keeping happy, keeping entertained. So again, all the things that you might, assume would be the case with a platform like gaming, but also, as I'd noticed previously, where we found a high parity of similar behaviors is that it was the case that these are the same types of emotional needs that things like streaming were tapping into. So again, one of the patterns that we've seen here, and I think something that we want to continue to investigate moving forward, is that the amount of potential synergies or interactivity between things like gaming and watching streaming is pretty high, to the point where we're beginning to think through, is there a world where, again, we're starting to see different patterns of things like second screening, i.e. instead of someone watching linear TV with social, they're in fact watching something like, streaming and gaming at the same time. So again, not something that we can extract out conclusively from this research, but again, starts to prompt some very interesting questions in terms of, again, how overall media appetites are starting to change. Now, for brands, understanding the baseline motivation of what someone is consuming a given media format for is important insofar that you can tailor a message that is specific to, or at least aligned with, the emotional valence that an individual is going to have for that particular platform. So as it pertains to gaming, it's pretty straightforward that these tend to be happy, positive environments. They tend to be involved in it. They want to be entertained when they go into these environments. So always looking for opportunities that won't be interruptive to the gameplay, but also things that tend to be congruent to these need states are going to really resonate with potential fans or consumers that they can reach through these platforms when you consider kind of that mindset that individuals are as they consume a media form like games. And aside from the emotional state that individuals are in as they're consuming this media, it's also kind of relevant to kind of keep in mind that, for the most part, folks are kind of a little strung out throughout the pandemic. And therefore, in a way that we're integrating in a positive manner, we still want to try to keep messages relatively simplistic. There's also ways that which we can kind of double down on the positivity on platforms like gaming by taking part in some of the initiatives that come out throughout the year, one of which being relevant for gaming was Play a Part Together, to kind of have a scenario where brands can kind of resonate where these platforms are playing an important part with individuals and consumers in terms of, one, their overall media diets, but then also how they're looking to relax during a time when, candidly, relaxation tends to be a little bit on the low side. Moreover, opportunities like things like branded integrations and sponsorships really kind of provide a much more richer palette through which brands can potentially integrate with some of these games in ways that won't be intrusive, and again, but can still resonate with the overall positivity that these platforms provide to consumers.
You like it?
So as noted, this is a study that we've conducted about media behaviors throughout the pandemic. It certainly won't be the only one. I think as we continue to understand how socially and culturally the pandemic has impacted, one, humans in general, but two, our overall capability and ways through which that we weave into the media ecosystem, this will be something that we continue to return to through various insight studies, along with the ongoing work that we have done throughout the last few years as it pertains to the power of gaming and even how individuals tend to think about and integrate with these platforms. So you can find more about this study and also keep track of some of the future work we're going to be doing in the future at activisionblizzardmedia.com. In the meantime, thank you so much for stopping by.